Lutcher Theater for hosting us this afternoon for our artist talk. And I'd like to make sure to invite you to join us at the Stark Museum of Art immediately after this program for a free reception. The Black Pioneers Legacy in the American West was organized by the James Museum of Western and Wildlife Art with guest curator Carolyn Mazloomi. Carolyn had planned to be here today but was unable to join us. And so before we get started with our artists, I'd like to take a minute and show you a video. This is featured in the exhibition, but it gives you a little more context to this exhibition and why it was so important for this exhibition to happen. Thank you.
When African people were brought here, they brought with them needlework skills already. So it was easy for enslaved Africans to be taught how to make quilts. I often say if quilts, especially those in Southern museums that have been attributed to white makers, if those quilts had voice, they would talk about the laying on of hands and needles by enslaved African American men and women. The Women of Color Quilters Network has been an important group. We as a group have done many exhibitions, not only here in the United States, but around the world. The founding members and long-term members are a very close-knit group, and I love that. There's power in that. Most of the quilts that originate out of our network and originate in the shows have to do with either African American history or some facet of living life here in America and racism in America. When people think in terms of quilts, they think in terms of warmth, hearth, home, protection. It's a non-threatening way to tell very, very difficult subjects that people, they don't want to read about them, but they will come to see them in the museum. I think it makes a difference in how people feel. If people know the history of African Americans in this country, they see us in a different light. So many of these stories are not necessarily known. We've always been contributors in so many ways to the fabric of this country, and people coming to the museum to see the show will see that. These quilts offer, especially in a museum setting, it's a safe place to talk about these difficult subjects, and that's important. To me, as a curator and as a historian, this exhibition has been a windfall because I learned a lot. Not only did I learn a lot, but the artists learned a lot. The artists themselves put a lot of work into studying the subjects of their quilts. It's been a learning experience for all of us. One of the things that never happened for me in school was to learn anything about African American history. It's important for me as curator to see that our best light shines and shines through our quilts. When you can create something to change the heart, spirit, and mind of an individual, then you've reached your goal as an artist. I want the viewers to leave the exhibition knowing that we, as African Americans, have participated in the making of this country since we stepped off the boat. African Americans have been explorers. They've been business people. They were cowboys. They've been part of the fabric of every facet of this country. And people will see that in the quilts. And I think that's important. Quilts have jumped off the bed onto the wall, and they're now seen as works of art. And that's the unexpected thing that people are astonished by, because these are not the quilts that your grandmother made. They truly are seen as works of art. The materials even that are used for the quilts are sometimes unorthodox. So we go beyond just the needle and thread, but you see some of everything on these quilts and every kind of material. This is the gift that the quilt maker gives to the viewer. It's about disseminating information through this beauty that's the spirit of the cloth. And the cloth can speak. African people believe that the colors and the patterns of the cloth have meaning. So with the use of cloth, we tell the stories not only of our culture, but the making of America. That's the story that we have to tell. That is about the Women of Color Quilters Network. This is what we do. This is what we enjoy. And it's our gift, not only to ourselves and our family, but a gift to the nation.
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Boehme, curator of art at the Stark Museum of Art, and I have the honor of introducing our panel today. We have three artists, Georgia Williams, Carolyn Crump, and Barbara McCraw, and I'll be introducing each one of them. We'll begin with Carolyn Crump. Fiber artist Carolyn Crump was born in Detroit, Michigan, and now lives and has her artist studio in Houston, Texas. She attended Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield, Michigan, and she works as a diverse artist in media from acrylic paints, etchings, handmade paper, clay and wood, and most recently fabric, where she excels in illustration, where she makes wonderful contributions as well. Her stunning quilts have been featured in many exhibitions, including at the Texas Quilt Museum in LaGrange, Texas, the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts, and the Textile Center of Minneapolis, Minnesota. She has works of art in permanent collections, such as the Michigan State University, and most importantly, the Smithsonian Museum of American Art's Renwick Gallery collection. She does incredible three-dimensional quilts, which you will see three of her works in the Black Pioneers exhibition. Carolyn Crump. Next, I'd like to introduce Barbara McCraw. Barbara grew up on the south side of Chicago and now lives and works in Navasota, Texas. She received a degree in English at Illinois State University and later another degree in medical technology. Her lifelong love of sewing began from taking classes and transitioned to teaching classes in quilting. She had the opportunity to teach quilting in Tanzania, Africa. She's achieved the master status in quilting. She's exhibited her award-winning works extensively and has quilts in the collections of the University of Michigan and North Carolina Central University. Right now, she has a one-person show on view at the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky. Barbara McCraw. And I would like to welcome now Georgia Williams. Georgia is a native of Beaumont, and she now lives and makes her quilts in Houston, Texas. She is a graduate of Lamar University nearby and has a master's degree in psychology from the University of Houston. After her retirement from her professional job, she turned to creative endeavors, including writing a children's book with her granddaughter. But she currently focuses on creating visual Black history through her fiber art. Through becoming a member of the Women of Culture's Quilters Network, she's found opportunities for exhibiting her work in quilt exhibitions where she's won numerous ribbons, such as Best of Show and Best Use of Embellishments. Locally, she exhibited quilts in an exhibition at the Museum of the Gulf Coast in Port Arthur a year or so ago. She currently has a quilt on loan to the Texas Quilt Museum and has a quilt on loan to the U.S. Embassy in Estonia. So welcome, Barbara. We're going to, I've got a few questions to ask each of the artists to explore their works of art, both works in the exhibition, and to talk about their careers in general. We're here to celebrate and have a prelude to viewing the exhibition Black Pioneers in the American West, which explores the path of Black history in the West with a timeline of the original pictorial quilts. The timeline begins in 1528 and continues through the Civil Rights Movement. So as I begin the first initial questions, I'm going to ask each of the artists to talk about the subject of her quilt and which pioneer she studied and represented in her quilt. So we'll kind of keep to the chronology a little bit in the exhibition. Although the three quilts that we'll be talking about today are from the 19th century subjects into the 20th century. But let us begin with Barbara McCraw and her quilt with the title Abby Fisher. You'll see a slide on the screen above you. Barbara, can you tell us about your subject? Who was Abby Fisher and why did you choose her? And what things did you learn about her? What kind of research did you do in doing the quilt of Abby Fisher?
Well, when I first heard about Abby Fisher, I decided to take that topic from Dr. Mazloomi and use it to make my quilt with. Over the years, Dr. Mazloomi will pass out, just sort of a list of different topics that we can choose from. Well, she was one, Abby Fisher was. She was a topic that really caught my attention because of her upbringing. My great-grandmother was a slave in a home, and she was actually, I don't know if they were married, but she was the partner of the owner of the plantation. In Abby Fisher's case, it was kind of the same subject, but the owner of the plantation, he was a Frenchman. He was very good to her from what I understand, and in 1860, she was freed to go to Alabama, and she married an Alexander Fisher at that point. Later on, through some of my research, there were some times that were missing. There were some little places where, who knows where she is. Well, she ended up on the 1880 census in San Francisco. And it was at that point that she began, with her husband, to exhibit some of her unique ways of making foods, baby foods, pickling, doing all sorts of cooking. And so that's what she became known as.
Great.
I can continue if you want.
Now that gives us a synopsis of Abby Fisher's and her importance as a cook and an entrepreneur, and she wrote a cookbook as well, right?
She did. That did come later. But what happened was first is that some friends invited her to the San Francisco Mechanic Fair, which was sort of like a state fair for us, if you don't know about a mechanics fair. And she won 3 ribbons in that show, which was pretty outstanding for a Black woman. And she went on to be very, very popular after that, and she was convinced that she needed to write a cookbook, which she did. I believe she's only the second Black woman that ever had a cookbook published, and she went on to do great things with that.
Wonderful. Georgia, will you tell us a little bit about your quilt? Kathy Williams, a.k.a. William Cathay, female buffalo soldier. And what a life she had.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for having us here. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate the recognition. Kathy Williams was the first female buffalo soldier. She was a Black woman in the 1860s that joined the Army disguised as a man. She was in the Army from 1866 to 1868. Until she was discovered when she went to the hospital that she was a woman, and then she received, because of her illness, she received a disability discharge. My quilt, when you go, hopefully when you will leave this auditorium and go over to the museum and experience all 50 of the quilts that have to do with African American history. On my particular quilt that you may be able to see in the slide, I start with when she was born, a slave in 1844, and it progresses along the way her whole life until she died, what they believe in 1893, and they believe that she died because she fell off the census. They didn't find a grave or anything, but that was the information that they used to determine that she had passed. Where her life was so full of so many different experiences, and I invite you to ask me questions, and when we get to the museum, this is a very limited time and a limited space, but I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have. This exhibition was the very first one that I was invited to participate in by Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi, who opened up this world of quilting to me because I had no idea that, a quilt to me was something that you quilted and you put on the bed. Like the one that I had at my grandmother's house, where when it was cold and they did not use heaters, they had so many quilts on you couldn't even turn over. But this is not your grandmother's quilt. So please go to the museum after we leave here and experience all the different stories because we're anxious to share with you.
Wonderful. All right, and then Carolyn, would you tell us about the quilt entitled The Game Changer? As I mentioned, Carolyn does have 3 quilts in the exhibition. Today we asked her to concentrate on The Game Changer, and she can tell you a little bit about what the title means and who she portrays.
My quilt is about Colonel Young. He was one of the first colonels, and I called it the game changer because he changed the game up. They would give him the worst equipment. He had to fix the guns, repair it. He had to, they would give him inexperienced soldiers, and he had to train them. But every time he would start something, he would raise the level. And so with my quilt, I have him coming off the page. I have him telling his own story. The gun in it, they kept telling me, that gun is not from that time. I said, I know. You see, he's jumping off the quilt. He changed the game up. So he was ahead of his time. So when I think of him, I think of a person that started from nowhere, but he's like a quilter. He takes nothing and make it out of something, and he changed the game. And I would always respect him because I didn't know about him until I had to research him. But that's one of my favorite quilts, only because he reminds me of what we have to do in life. We have to step out and we have to change the game.
So how did you find resources on your subject?
Through the internet. And it wasn't easy because one person might say this, another website might say that. You're getting all this different information, and if you mess up, you have to start over again. So, that had happened to me several times that I had to trash a quilt and start over, but usually on the internet I received, and it's a lot of documentaries about him.
It's great. So we're going to go back and look at each quilt again, and I'd like each of the artists to talk a little about how she made this particular quilt, what kind of artistic choices she made to carry the story. Because these are pictorial quilts, and each of the artists brings a particular artistry to the piece, and we want to explore that as well. So we'll go back to Barbara again and talk about the Abby Fisher, particularly maybe how you dealt with showing a scene on a flat surface, the quilt.
Okay. One of the things that usually happens to me is that I will be thinking about the subject. I will be reading about it. I will be trying to put this information together. And I don't think it's ever failed me that I don't go to sleep at night and wake up with the vision in my head on the ceiling if I'm laying on my back. It is the most amazing thing. And when I woke up that morning, I knew exactly what I wanted. I didn't know how I was going to get there, but I knew where to start. And so I started with the room. I knew I did not want the room to be just a square box, and so then I started researching perspective and how to make it look like the floors went this way and the walls went this way, and even the ceiling. So I got that part done, and then I decided that I wanted windows, and I wanted there to be trees outside of the windows. That's all sort of extraneous to the subject. I found a picture of my great-grandmother, and I actually used her as the face on Abby Fisher. I looked up old dresses from the 1860s, and I found out that, she would be wearing this sort of dress, this kind of shoes, and so on. One of the things that I particularly thought about is that all of her cooking supplies, I wanted there to be pickled jars of strawberries and all kinds of things that were on a shelf that she could reach and get. I also wanted to show this long table with all of the different recipes that she had used, and most of all, I wanted to show the 3 blue ribbons that she had won for the prizes that she won at the State Fair in San Francisco that year. So that's pretty much it. The rest of it was fun, finding fabric. I'm not a trained artist, but I can get things from the internet, things like there's a free clip art site where you can find maybe a silhouette of a person, and so it'll show you how to walk or how to, the movements, if they're walking this way, which arm goes this way and which goes that. It helped me a lot with different things, and that quilt and with others, but it's just a matter of every step that I took. There was research to go into it, and then I grabbed fabric and started playing with it and cutting it into patterns.
So and you were able to find fabric of the different pickles and other items to preserve?
You know what? I had everything but the pickles. And then again, here's the internet. I got online. I need fabric that has pickles on it. In fact, my husband just the other day, he said, "What are you doing with all the rest of this pickle fabric?" I said, "I don't know, just put it back."
Pickle quilt in the future.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, and then Georgia, will you tell us about some of the artistic decisions around Kathy Williams?
Yes, I want to begin by saying, since this was my first opportunity to exhibit a quilt based on an actual story of a live person, or a past live person, Dr. Mazloomi told me initially, make sure that it's a narrative quilt, a quilt that tells a story, as opposed to a portrait quilt. Because once you get your name of the person that you're going to represent in your art, it can't just be a picture of them. It has to tell their story. Well, I'm so glad that she gave me that information about do your research, do your research, do your research. Because the first thing for somebody that's a novice, they start thinking about the quilt, they start thinking about making something pretty. And what if she's all dressed up and she's standing next to a horse? Wouldn't that be beautiful? And then I do my research. I buy 2 books about Kathy Williams, 2 or 3 books about Kathy Williams from the internet, from Amazon. And I start doing my research and reading about her and what all she encountered. And then I found out that she was in the infantry, which was foot soldiers, and people that rode horses were in the cavalry. If I had not done my research, you may have seen a quilt with Kathy Williams standing next to a horse. Well, anyway, in the book, I was able to go through her life, stage by stage, where she was able, I tried to represent each stage. As I said, the first one was when she was a slave baby. And that particular baby on the quilt that you'll be able to see better at the museum is actually a picture of my grandmother's brother. So I was able to incorporate some of my family history into my first quilt. Back then, in that time period, little boys wore dresses until they were like 2. So then I went on to the tobacco plantation that she was raised on. And then when she was taken as contraband to serve in the Union Army, where she had to be the cook and the laundress. So there's a depiction of her doing laundry and a campfire with the fire around it and whatever. And then when the Emancipation Proclamation came along and she was free, there's a picture of the actual Emancipation Proclamation. And then there's a picture of her. She decided that she wanted to do something with her life other than work for somebody else. And I made sure that I included quotes from Kathy Williams about her life and how she was raised. Because when she was a little girl, her mother instilled in her, even though you're enslaved, your mind is not a slave, and you belong to yourself, and you are the daughter of a queen. And at the bottom of the quilt, I try to depict that, where her mother's there and her grandmother is there, dressed as a queen, before she was taken from Africa. And then, coming around, she ended up working for herself as a seamstress until she passed in 1893. And it wasn't until 2016, which is also depicted on the quilt, where she was actually recognized as an American heroine, and there's a bronze statue of her in Leavenworth, Kansas, depicting her worth and her importance to our African American culture.
Would you further comment a little bit about your choice of colors and fabrics? And then one other thing I want, even though you were able to get 3 books about Kathy Williams, are there any known photographs of her, or is your portrait?
Not really.
Yeah.
There are several books, and most of the books have a different depiction of what she may have looked like. So the depiction on my quilt is my interpretation of what she may have looked like based on the descriptions in the book, her physical descriptions, not the actual picture. There's only one picture on the quilt that is thought to be an actual picture of her, and that's when I have her depicted as in 1893 as a seamstress in Colorado. That's known to be an actual picture of her, but there were no pictures of her
As a soldier.
before that time, so I came up with my own.
Yeah. Well, so often we don't have historical documentation like we think we do in the 20th century,
Right.
21st centuries. Yeah.
So I took artistic liberties, and that's my
Yeah.
Kathy Williams. Yeah.
And tell us about your colors and fabrics.
Okay, I wanted to make the base of the quilt mud cloth from Africa to show where she came from and the significance of just how rich our culture was and how rich our culture is if we just stop to realize where we came from and where we're going. And so the mud cloth and the letters of the quote at the bottom, "You are the daughter of the queen," are colors from the African flag and the African nation. And so yeah, I mean, her uniform is because she was in the Union Army. Her skin color tone was based on depictions of her in the history that I read about her. And so that's kind of where it all came from.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then, Carolyn, will you tell us about some of the artistic decisions in The Game Changer?
When I start a quilt, I like dimension. And basically, it might be one quilt, but it might have from 100 to 500 little small mini quilts to make up the one quilt. Because I like working in dimension. I like for things to jump out off the page, off the quilt. Even when I paint, even when I draw, I do it in layers. When I sew clothes, I do it in layers. I like layers. And I use the color gray because I wanted it to look old from that time period. He was an artist, so I wanted to he used to draw these maps just so the soldiers would know where to go and how to get away from things. So I wanted to put his map. So he's standing on his map there. But when you go over to the museum, you'll see that there's so many different layers to make up one quilt. I mean, it's just how my brain thinks. It's not one little piece, and people think that, why are you working so many layers? Well, it's kind of easier to work smaller and make it big than to start big and try to fight with that quilt.
You use the traditional quilt pattern in your narrative quilt. Can you tell us what the meaning for that element?
Because of his slave background, I wanted to put the traditional quilt in. But I also put it in because I come from a traditional background. And you know, as an artist or a quilter, when something becomes easy to you, then you want to change it up. My first quilt was flat, And it became easy to me, so I had to challenge myself. And that's why, you know, I started to grow as an artist, as a quilter.
And that sort of leads us in, because we've talked a little bit about the quilts in the exhibition, but I'd like to hear more about your own background, how each of you came into quilting. We've heard a little bit about that, but your story, and why you work in fabric, and maybe a little bit about your process in fabric. So this time, let's start with Georgia. If you would talk just about your art career. You talked about your relationship with Carolyn Mazloomi. But...
Yes, well, actually, my art career started when I was a little girl, because I used to draw all the time, and my parents would, as any parent would, hang my pictures on the wall or whatever. So as far as quilting goes, my very first quilt I made was about 30 years ago. I made a quilt for my mother. It was a memory quilt with pictures of all of her grandchildren on it. I still have it today as being my first quilt. And when I look at it, I wonder, why don't these points meet? But, and I have 11 grandchildren. I'm blessed to have 11 grandchildren. I have 2 sons and a bonus son and a bonus daughter. And of course, all of those have quilts. My sons have quilts. My daughter-in-laws have quilts. Family members, friends. So I've done quilting a while. My background, actually, my educational background, I have a master's degree in psychology, but that season's passed. And then I did costuming for a very dear friend and my brother-in-law for 15 years. COVID hit, that shut down everything. We stopped having to do plays and whatever, so you're stuck in the house. What are you gonna do? So then I started joining on Facebook these quilting groups. African fabric groups, and that was, I started getting into competitions or challenges where they'll send you fabric and say, make something out of this based on this theme. And that's kind of how I started, and then going through the Facebook group, I ran across the Women of Color's Quilters Network, and I contacted them to find out about the organization, and I sent Dr. Mazloomi a picture of some of the work that I had done in one of the challenges. She said, I love your work. And when we do the next thing that we're going to do, I'll contact you. And I thanked her, and a couple of months later, she invited me to join my first exhibition, which was this exhibition. And 9 or 10 exhibitions later, I'm happy to say that I found my passion in my later years.
Carolyn, would you share your background and decisions as an artist?
I started painting when I was 8 years old. I had 5 older siblings, and my 3 sisters were sewing and painting Michael Jackson covers and all kind of crazy stuff. But I wanted to be like them. So they would buy me oil painting sets, and I would paint and paint. And I stopped painting oil because one day I looked, the picture was beautiful, and I looked, it was gone, it was on my arm. And I was like, I don't like oil. So I started doing acrylic and watercolor. But trying to be like them made me love painting and drawing, but nobody could draw and paint now, so I don't know how they taught me. And in my neighborhood, they used to come around with a cart, and they would teach us how to paint, how to draw, and how to, with this little card, and when they finished the art, then they would bring us lunch, then we'd start out again. And I don't care where I go, I always meet someone from a small neighborhood that was an artist. And it was like they was feeding into us art. So it just came naturally to me because of my siblings. My mother was an artist, as far as she was a creative genius. When I tell you she could sew, knit, I mean, she wanted to paint her own house, paint things on the wall, and she was just ahead of her time. But I always wanted to go back to fabric. And one day I just started painting on this fabric, and I started sewing it. And the lady that represents me out of New York and Maryland, she put it on her website, started selling it. And Dr. Mazloomi came across the piece, and she tried to get in contact with me, but the lady that represented me wouldn't give me the information. And so a gallery in Texas that I deal with called me up one day, and I was really sick at the time. And she called me up and she said, this lady, Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi, kept trying to get in contact with you. And so I called her back, and I'll never forget that day because I was cleaning out the car for my daughter. She was graduating from high school, and she was taking my car. And Dr. Mazloomi told me, she said, I'll never forget this. She said, remember this. I've never been wrong. It stars in your future, girl. And it always touched my heart because I was so sick at the time. But it gave me the energy to get up and push on. But that's how I started with the gym. Sorry.
And it's so interesting, two of you at least came to quilting somewhat later in life after your other professions. And I just want to put a plug in for our education department that says art is for everyone. And you can take up art at any time, and it may become your passion, as we've seen here as well. So, and each of you brought some of your other quilts, and I wanted an opportunity for you to be able to talk about some of the current work that you're doing. We'll start with Carolyn, if we may. Would you talk about the quilt works that you brought?
The first one that's closest to me is a Buffalo Soldier vase. And I weaved the vase first, and then I did my little traditional layered pattern. There's over 1,000 little mini quilts on that vase. And I attached it to it, but it's telling, when you go around it, it's telling the story of the Buffalo Soldiers. The farthest one away from me is a story by John Lewis, says, stand for something. And I have her holding the picture of John Lewis, but it actually was how I pushed myself to increase my, I guess, design skills. I'll put different numbers in a basket and I'll pull it out. And whatever number on there is attached to a color. It might have attached to a theme. All of that is built from just different numbers. And I have to make it work. So you know, in life, you deal a hand, you have to make it work. You take the lemon, you make lemonade. So a lot of my quilts are designed like that. So that way, I can't go look on the internet, I can't go look on this, I can't do this. I mean, when it said I had to have 12 little squares in it, I had to put those blue squares in it. It was, I said I had to paint and I had to do my illustration technique. So I had to use this brown fabric and I had to use this crazy fabric in the middle. But I had to take it and I had to make it work. So it's a way that I push myself when it comes to designing. It's not like I just draw a picture. It'll take me longer to try to figure out, I mean, because it's something I didn't know, you know. I got the theme John Lewis, I had to put his saying in there, had to do a picture of him, but I picked this theme up and I picked the different numbers and the different colors, and then I made a quilt from it. So a lot of times that's how I design, so it's not like I'm doing the same thing. It pushed me to another level. And that's actually one of the first times in a long time, other than a piece over at the museum, that is just flat. You know, everybody asked me about the piece in the museum. You do all this dimension, what happened there? And I said, I had a week to do it. When they asked me to do it, I was like, what? He said, could you do this in a week? I said, it's gonna be flat. So I had a week to do it, and that's what happened. So if I have to do it fast, Because usually it only takes me about 2 weeks to do a quilt. But it takes me about 6 months to research it and study it.
And talk a little more about the vase, and do you do a lot of works that are not just the art quilts, but that are object quilts?
It is. I like doing vessels. I like doing vases. I like doing wall sculptures that's abstract. You know, people think since I do a lot of narrative, that's my favorite thing. But no, I like nature. I like landscapes. I like abstracts. I just like art. I see beauty in everything.
And I want to add that she made beautiful, beautiful masks during COVID.
Thank you.
Yes, those are extraordinary. Each of these artists has works that you can see as well on the internet, and Carolyn's pieces that are in the Smithsonian collection are masks that came out of the COVID study, and they're just amazing. You might want to go back to wearing masks.
I don't think you can wear these anyway. Or they might put you in a crazy house.
Okay. Barbara, would you tell us a little bit about the 3 quilts that you brought here in the center?
Let me just refresh my mind. What was that? I decided a couple of years ago that I wanted to learn how to make portraits. I had done a lot of different things, and I had a quilt that I had worked on for 3 years, and it won a lot of awards, and I was really pleased with it. It was a family quilt, but it was done, and so I'm going to teach myself how to make portrait quilts. Well, again, we all do a lot of research and a lot of studying, and so I found out that if I got an Adobe Photoshop, and I am one of the most computer illiterate people that you will ever see, but I figured out that if I bought a couple of books and I looked at the screen while I was reading the book, I could figure out at least how to get a picture from my family and then pixelate it the way they said. And I got halfway through with it and I couldn't figure out the rest from the book, and so I just made it up. But I've done a couple of other of these, but I started with my grandmother. This is Elizabeth Delia Virgin, and she's this lady over here on the end. The original picture that I had of her, she is sitting next to her husband at the time, which was Roy Virgin, who is this gentleman over here. And they were sitting together, and she had on an old, I don't know, I guess it was just like a sackcloth dress, but she had 2 babies, one in each arm, and the babies had on the same fabric outfits. And I found out later that they'd never lived to be much older than they were. But I wanted to give them a voice, and so I made my grandmother, who I knew and who lived with us until she passed in Chicago. She was, I believe, 86. And I got a call one day from my niece in Chicago, and she said, "Aunt Barb, I want you to make a picture of my dad and my mom. He had cancer, and they had just found out about it." And I said, "Okay, I'll do that." She said, "I'll send you a picture." And she has no idea how long it takes me to make a quilt. It takes a long time. But I said, "Okay, I do it," and she didn't put any time restraints on me. So she called me back about 2 days later, and she said, "Oh, I forgot, I want you to put Grandma in it too." And I said, "Okay." But anyway, she sent me the picture, and it was just a slice of my brother and his wife, Yvonne. And I decided I had to add the rest of the head to Melvin, my brother, and then the rest of Yvonne's head. And then I found a photograph of my mother that I was able to put together. I found this fabric that it's made by, it's called Sakwa, and I can't remember, it's some sort of screen fabric from Quilters. But this particular fabric I've had in my closet for years, and for some reason I took it out and it seemed perfect to represent the Chicago skyline, just the movement of the skyline to me. And so I use that in there as well. And that's a picture of my brother, my sister-in-law, and my mother, all of whom have passed. And She doesn't know that I've made it yet, so I'm going to give it to her for Christmas, but I thought I'd like to bring it and share it with you.
Thank you. And then Georgia, will you tell us about the quilts you brought?
Yes, I will say that after I made the Kathy Williams quilt, and I started being involved with other members of the Women of Color Quilters Network, and all of seeing the exhibition of all the African history that I did not know about, I decided that I was going to start doing narrative quilts about little known Black history, at least little known to me. And as I started creating these quilts, I found out it's little known to my friends too. Because they'll say when they look at one of my quilts, I didn't know that. You teach me something every time you finish a quilt. So these two quilts right here represent this quilt at the end down here. This is Mr. Willis Wynn. This was actually a photograph taken in 1939 that I recreated. It's from the Library of Congress, so it's copyright free. I recreated in a quilt to show him. He was recorded, his recorded age of death was 116. He's sitting in the cabin, a one-room cabin that he lived in. He's holding a slave horn. I did not know slave horns existed. This is the horn that they used, that they blew at 4 o'clock every morning for them to get up and get ready to go work in the fields. They blew the horn for them to come out of the fields. This was what they used to summon the slaves with. I did not know this existed, and so I wanted to depict it on this quilt so that everybody else would see it too. And I'm hoping that my quilts provoke thought so that people that see them will start thinking about it and maybe researching it themselves and finding out what else they don't know that they weren't taught growing up. So that was the latest one that I did. This one is near and dear to my heart. I hope you can see it. It's called the Middle Passage Guardian. It depicts an angel with the African fabric as part of the feathers in her wings. It has the slave children that she's guarding, that they're on the slave ship during the Middle Passage. You probably can't see the bottom because it's behind the table, but they're actual images that I took from, there's an underwater slave memorial off the coast of Grenada that I was able to get permission from the artist to use in this. And these images at the bottom showing the watery grave of the slaves that either jumped overboard because they weren't going to be enslaved, or they were thrown overboard if they died during the passage. They were just thrown over like garbage. So this is a very emotional quilt for me, and it just evokes so much emotion when I look at it. This is one of the ones that when I was working on it, I kept welling up. But the Middle Passage Guardian, I think the font is very relevant because the name of that font is called Out of Africa. So this is my depiction of the Middle Passage Guardian guarding slave children.
Several of you have mentioned the importance of the Women of Color Quilters Network and your work with Carolyn Mazloomi, but I just want to ask if you had anything else to add about what being in a network like that has meant to you in your career that you haven't yet said.
Well, I'll go first. We are so connected. I say we all live in different cities, but we stay in contact. We get feedback from each other. It's like it's a whole family. I mean, not just the Women of Color Quilters Network, but I belong to several Facebook quilting groups that you can bounce ideas off of. The quilters, I don't quilt my quilts myself, but I have 2 wonderful quilters, one here in Houston and one in California. I have good friends. I usually know what I'm going to do, but if I get stuck, I'll say, what do you think about this? What does this say to you? And then I'm able to work out whatever problem I have. But quilters are a whole family, and I love it.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I ask, because we definitely get that idea. And so often we think of artists as being solitary, and many are, but it's clear from your works and your remarks how important the network has been and how it's helped you to grow.
One of the things that I think about a lot, or I thought about, is that when we are born into this world, we're wrapped in fabric. And when we leave this world, we're also wrapped in fabric. And there's something about the touch, the tactile nature of fabric that brings comfort, and it brings warmth, and it brings so many things. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're so connected to this fabric. We've had careers. I was a pathology supervisor at UT Southwestern. We've all had great careers, but art and this touching fabric is something that's very important to us. And if I could just briefly share with you, when I lectured, there was a lady that I read. Her name was Aunt Jane. And she talked about just one little paragraph, and if I could share that, it said, I've been a hard worker my whole life, but most all my work has been the kind that perishes with the using, as the Bible would say. Now I got the idea that I'm a good housekeeper, but when I'm dead and gone, ain't nobody gonna remember all the floors I've scrubbed, and all the clothes I've washed, and all the dishes I've washed. But when one of my grandchildren, or my great-grandchildren, sees one of these old quilts, they're gonna think about Aunt Jane. And wherever I am then, I'll know I ain't forgotten. Thank you.
About the guild and the connection that we have. Anytime we need to know something, we can reach out. When we go to another museum, you would think it was a bunch of families sitting there. We laughing and talking and having a good time. But nobody is afraid to share the information. You know, like a lot of careers, people are so afraid to share because they're afraid you're going to get to the top before them. But these women that's in this show and that I'm a part of their lives, we're on each other's shoulders. We got on Dr. Mazloomi's shoulders. And I pray to the good Lord that somebody can get on my shoulders. And I can help push them. You know, because it's a big world and there's a lot of art for all of us to design. I mean, nobody have the copyright on art. You know, it's just that we have to be givers. My whole life I have tried to be a giver, to give and to teach. And a lot of times people think, what she wants, she trying to make us learn. But the love I have in my heart for art, it changed my life. My life will never be the same. I've been places that I never thought I would go. I was picked to do the poster for How Sweet the Sound. And just so happened, they picked me to do the finale, and it was in Detroit, my hometown. So my mother and everybody got a chance to go. But I was confused because I had a quilt that was in the museum there. I said, you go see no, we'll go see it. I'm like, nah, go see the quilt. Once I got there and I took them to see the quilt, like I'm begging them. Oh, that's art. I thought you were talking about a bed quilt. I'm like, a bed quilt. But when she was in the audience and they had me stand up and they said, world-renowned artist, she looked up at me and she said, look what this little country girl made. That touched my heart more than anything because she didn't go to the museum to see the quilt, you know. But it touched me. So when she looked up at me like, oh, I'm proud of her.
That's great. Well, we're about to wind up. I want to give you the opportunity to say any final words, anything you wanted to say that you didn't get to say, anything about the significance of this Black pioneers' legacy in the American West that you want to share as we get ready to go over and look at it.
I believe this exhibit teaches us, it tells a story of life, of culture and people that most people are not going to read that many books, but you could go look at the art and you could say, man, this happened? And I think quilt exhibits make you a better person. If you really go and you go look at it and you read the book, it makes you realize, oh, we came from somebody. We're great people.
Well, that's what education does. I've always felt that way. I was one of 5 in my family, and I was always laughed at and criticized because I wasn't going to the clubs and I wasn't doing things that my brothers and sisters were doing. I always had my head in the book, and so they laughed at me, and that was okay. But I got into some really good schools. I had some really good counselors that were able to get me in really good places. I was one of the first Black people in Chicago to receive a scholarship to go to Princeton. I didn't go. My parents couldn't afford it, but I was offered. And sometimes it's nice to be offered.
Amen.
And I just use education it's always been, I just suck knowledge up, whatever it is. I can see a fly on the wall, and I wonder what kind of fly is that. And so then let me go get a book, and I'll look at it, and I'm not much for, I don't do social media and things like that, but I love to look up things. I love to learn things, and I'm very grateful that my dear husband listens to me all the time and asks me questions, and then that I can go look up too. But for me, it was just the knowledge, and I think it broadens us. It expands us in ways that we will never, ever realize how deep and how profitable it is for us to know what that person's like, to know what kind of background that is, or Sicilians, what do they love, and what do they like, what do they hate? And then to know out of all of that we're all the same. We're all the same.
I'd like to end by thanking everyone that showed up today to listen to us, and especially my friends and family that I know are out in the audience. This light is really bright, and I can't really see you. But I know you're out there, and I hope that you continue on to the museum so that I can love on you. And thank you so much for coming. And as Dr. Mazloomi says, people don't read a lot these days, and this is your opportunity to find out about some Black history that you may or may not know. That's on the wall. It's a visual Black history representation for you to take a look at. And next to each portrait or next to each quilt is an artist statement giving the information regarding the quilt and how it came to be. So please take the time to go over and educate yourself.
And thank you, Georgia. So now I have to acknowledge my Cubby Glenn family. Thank you. And the red hat.
And before we leave, we have the 3 wonderful artists on the panel, but we do have some other artists who have works in the exhibition who have come to be with us today. And I'd like each of them to stand and wave so you can see them. We'll have an opportunity to visit with the artists as we go. From Lake Forest, California, who did the quilt Allensworth, California. Jeanette Wave, yes, see again, all right. And Deborah Harris from Elotes, Texas, who did Edward Five Scallops Rose. And Thomasita Louvier Legans from Austin, Texas. Kersey. Who knew that Lamar had so many quilters? So, and she did the quilt Men of Valor, Sergeant Benjamin Brown, and Corporal Isaiah May. So be sure and see their work and visit with them. Did I miss any of those other quilters in the exhibition come in? Okay. I do want to invite you all to the Stark Museum of Art. We'll have the exhibition, Black Pioneers, Legacy on the American West on view, and we'll have refreshments in the lobby and a chance to visit with the artists and learn more about their works of art and their careers. And I think you're going to have a wonderful experience seeing this incredible exhibition and the extraordinary work that went into it. Jennifer, any final words?
I'd just like to thank you all for being here today. This is such an incredible opportunity. I'm so grateful to our panel artists and to our other artists who've attended. I do want to say thank you to the Stark Foundation and Eldestine H.J. Lutcher Stark Foundation for supporting this program, enthusiastically supporting this, hosting this exhibition, and all of the programs that are going to go along with it. We are just excited to have this here, and we cannot wait to share this incredible exhibition with you. Thank you for taking your time to be here. Please cross the street. As Sarah mentioned, we have some wonderful refreshments from Free State Winery and Cellars. They are inspired by the quilts, some of which you saw today. One of them is a focaccia from Abby Fisher's recipe with pickled vegetables. So I can personally tell you that I tasted it and it's incredible, and I probably ate too much at the tasting. So a number of those wonderful refreshments. We also have live jazz music, and some of our educators, you'll see them in these quilted sweaters, will be in the galleries ready to talk to you about works by the artists who aren't here today. They're really excited to see you. We can't wait to greet you over at the museum. So thank you again for being here. Thank you to the Lutcher Theater for hosting us.